Hi, this is going to be somewhat of a test video of sorts. You may have noticed that sometimes in my blog type of videos I experience some stuttering when it comes to the audio or choppiness. Sometimes the words get cut off, and I am trying to figure out why that happens. If I upload this video, then I have already checked the entire video and there are no issues. So in this experiment, I am filming from a longer distance from the lenses. I think it has to do with the adjustment when it comes to the lighting. And I am recording this during the day because I usually wait until at night because I need to finish a lot of stuff, duties, work, etc. But I am currently recording in this free time. So I think that because my computer is pretty much a toaster, a potato, there will always be a bit of a issue when it comes to the video image. But what I consider to be most important is the audio. The audio needs to be somewhat clear at least. So I am trying to do my best at adjusting the audio. Okay, this time I wanted to talk about the difference between psionics and magic in tabletop role-playing games, because I sometimes see this confusion. And it's actually very simple to spot the difference or to identify the differences. And I am also going to give you some tips on how you can use psionics and magic in a more realistic campaign, so to speak. Let's call it low fantasy, the lowest fantasy level possible. Well, the difference, like I said, is actually quite simple. Psionics, they have to do with using your mind as a sort of muscle. Anything that you can directly affect through your mind, that's psionics. Telekinesis, causing something to burst on fire, perhaps clairvoyance or clairaudience, where you are seeing or hearing things that are related to something hidden, something that is about to happen, etc. And remember, this is all science fiction. Maybe some things could be identified as something else, but for the purpose of fictional tabletop role-playing games, that's science fiction. And why do they call such skills psionics? Why not psychic powers? This has to do, at least in my opinion, with the way that Gary Gygax made psionics somewhat popular when he first introduced them to tabletop role-playing games, or at least to Dungeons and Dragons. Many of you perhaps are already familiar with this, but both the Blackmoor setting and Greyhawk setting, at least at first, they were science fantasy settings. I think this is more evident in Blackmoor, but in Greyhawk, things could feel a bit more like medieval fantasy, but there are actually some hints that Gygax wanted to create this science fantasy world. So psionics comes from the combination of psychic and electronics. Supposedly, there were aliens in the past of Greyhawk that, or in Blackmoor, you can also see this alien technology sometimes. And in the case of Greyhawk, these beings use their superior technology to bring about psionics. It is thought that the characters that have psychic powers, or rather psionics, in present times, so to speak, within those settings, is because of the result of some strange machinery or perhaps bioengineering. It could be like a stalker situation, like the Zone, where there are pockets of weird activity because the strange aliens left some technology that affects the minds of people, that causes mutations and such. So that's why they always say psionics in most Dungeons and Dragons systems or settings, in a campaign setting or in different variations of Dungeons and Dragons, because the characters, even though that's not the intention of some authors in present times, the root of it all lies in the combination of the psyche, the human mind, or the mind of humanoids, in the case of those species and races, with electronic devices, psionics, electronics. I sometimes think that maybe some other term would have been better used, perhaps just using psychic powers, because not all technology, yes, not all technology should be based on electronics. Maybe it's something a bit weirder, or from an alternative source of both technology and power sources. Now, when it comes to magic, magic always relies on external forces. You could say many things about the internal mindset or the emotional state of the caster and all of that. For example, in the case of sorcerers, or the traits of the magical bloodlines and whatnot. But it always has to do with interacting with some energy that exists in the game world. It's not like your mind is an extension, but rather that your words, your gestures, the reagents, ingredients, material components that you are using, it has some sort of effect on the game world. It's as if you are in this ocean and you can manipulate the waters within that ocean. And it often has to do as well with the participation or intervention of different deities, extraplanar beings, all of that. So in order to simplify the understanding between psionics and magic, you could say that psionics or psychic powers, they are more internal. They are more like using your mind as some sort of muscle. Perhaps there could be some other nuances, like your aura extends itself and you have this field that you manipulate to affect the world around you. But when it comes to magic, it's as if you are activating things through keys, through words that serve as keys, through gestures, through materials that have some effect upon the world, and suddenly this happens. Just as if you are starting a fire, you're using your fire starter kit or whatever, your flint and your stone and anything. You create a spark, you have your tinder, and then you produce fire. You combine the oxygen with a heat source and a fuel, you have fire. So magic is more like that. Magic is more akin to a certain scientific approach, so to speak. And how can you use the psychic powers or psionics and magic in more realistic campaigns? By making them as subtle as possible, removing all of the over-the-top elements. In the case of psionics or psychic powers, they are just some very useful but difficult to verify effects. For example, maybe the character has a premonition that if the group takes that tunnel while driving, or if they go into that building, or if they do something, this other thing is going to happen. Something good, something bad. If you want to handle things that are considered a bit more over the top or impressive, but you want to keep things as low fantasy as possible, they would be very minor manifestations. Do you remember? Well, I'm going to avoid spoilers, but there is this movie where the character has psychic powers, and at the end of the film, but his powers are very subtle, more like I said, premonition, telepathy. But there is this moment where he has to activate something from a distance, and he puts all of his effort, all of his mental strength into turning or activating something. And he does it just very little, just enough so that he accomplishes his objective, but you can tell that he is pretty much spent. You can imagine that character perhaps taking a day off or two because of all of that effort that he used in manipulating that object at a distance. Very different from more high fantasy settings, where, yes, magic psionics are more impressive. They can lift things, several things at the same time, kind of like a Jedi using the Force. So it's all about that, keeping things subtle. When it comes to magic, in real life, you're not going to be casting, well, according to, let's say, occult philosophy, you're not going to be casting fireballs, you're not going to be doing all of those pyrotechnics, flashy effects. It's more like bringing good luck and bad luck. Of course, like I said, it's a very delicate thing. Remember, all of this is science fiction, but you could obtain greater manifestations And it will still be very difficult to verify, because nowadays there are so many great special effects. Many people have been tricked using those special effects, especially concerning, let's say, spatial matters. But because we have greater special effects or more advanced technology, it's quite easy to fake some results. So it's all up to you to find out on your own if those things are real, what is possible and what is not possible, through a disciplined and painstaking approach. Is that the way that you say it? Just like a very rigorous, very disciplined approach to see if those things actually have some reality to them. But in most cases, whenever you employ magic, and usually related to interactions with some beings like demons, angels, beings of the fairy, all of that, it usually translates into good luck or bad luck. So if you want to represent some sort of battle between sorcerers in real life, when a sorcerer is afflicted by the spells of another one in a low fantasy campaign, it will be more like on the side of suffering economic losses, accidents, sickness. And when something good happens, then you would see that suddenly you have this streak of good luck, everything starts to flow okay or even perfectly. You suddenly come up with this source of income, or suddenly you recover from some sort of condition that you had, or you experience great power and agility in your physical endeavors. It could be all of that. So in low fantasy games, you could handle psionics, as I mentioned, as very subtle effects. And there are just so many variations of psychic powers. You just need to do some research. Oh, I want to use astral projection in my tabletop role-playing games of low fantasy. Then just add some subtle effects that perhaps some very minor changes or some changes that happen on the long term occur after you do some things on the astral plane. In the case of ceremonial magic, then when you are perhaps, like I said, battling with another magic user, the one who is affected is going to suffer all sorts of bad things. That person is going to feel as if the entire world is collapsing around him or her. And if you are benefited by the effects of those ceremonies, then it seems like you are suddenly hit with this streak of good luck, good fortune all around. Of course, when it comes to drawbacks in both psionics and magic, when it comes to using psychic powers, it has such a strain on the mind and the body that sometimes other parts of your physiology suffer for it. Perhaps if a character is constantly doing things using his eyesight, maybe he has he has the ability to employ this sort of evil eye effect. Like he drills a hole into the aura of the victim, perhaps because he has been straining himself or herself so much, he ends up with eye problems. Or maybe it's something temporarily, like maybe you start to shed tears of blood, like something got a bit damaged in there. Or you suffer that thing, how do you call it in English, when you see a lot of lights? In Spanish we call it neuralgia, but in English, yes, well, that when you see a lot of lights and you can't see well. And in the case of magic, this is usually an imbalance. For example, maybe a person is very irresponsible, it's pretty much a thug, and he does some sort of evil ceremony, sacrifices children or whatever. You know how they do it in Freemasons, Illuminati, in science fiction. And suddenly they have the world at their disposal. They are prime ministers, they are billionaires, they are movie stars, but they always end up with these horrible deaths and addiction and problems with drug, alcohol, horrible sicknesses. And that's the thing, because they weren't prepared, they weren't virtuous to handle such great power. And it's kind of like the forces of magic overcompensated, like we gave you these rewards, you did nothing to deserve them, so now you're going to be punished for it. So that's one way of handling things. And thank you for watching this video. I hope the audio turns out well in this occasion. I would love to hear your thoughts and your comments on psionics, magic, etc. How do you handle them? Do you still think that they are the same thing? And thank you so much for those of you that are going the extra mile to support the channel. If anyone else wishes to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.